Hello, seventh grade. So, yesterday we heard about Henry and all of his wives, his 6 wives, and his desperate longing for a son, which he finally does get with Jane Seymour, but then she dies a few weeks later. And he still has Mary from his first wife, Catherine, and Elizabeth from Anne Boleyn, whom he had beheaded. And he has really now taken up this position that he is the supreme authority of the church and the nation. There's a lot of power in one place. And at this time, as I said yesterday and the day before, England is still very Catholic. And while it is fed up with the indulgences and the clergy living these sort of luxury lifestyles, they still held on to a lot of the same doctrines, the same services, the same beliefs that the Catholic Church held. So while Luther, if you remember, got rid of the statues and there's no praying to the saints, and you shouldn't be praying for someone to get out of purgatory. A lot of things changed. This real move towards simplicity in the church was not like that in the English Reformation. A lot of things pretty much stayed the same, except this authority of the Pope. They still had bishops, they still had archbishops, and a lot of the same services were held in terms of how Mass was said. So he comes in, and Henry, really now has taken this power. And one of the things he did do also was dissolve the monasteries. So there were lots of monasteries all over Europe where the monks were doing religious work, and a lot of them transcribing things. But now that the printing press is going to be coming and has come, and so things are more easily accessible. But the monasteries also did other things in the community. They were often schools. They were like schools where children could go to at least learn to read and do simple math, which would be important if you were even just a farmer. They could care for the poor who might be in need of food. It was commonly known that if you were a traveler and you had nowhere to stay and you were kind of lost, that if you came upon a monastery, they would take you in. They would welcome you in and give you a place to stay. So he took over a lot of these monasteries because they had wealth and they were on property, they had land. And of course, he would send his men in there. A lot of this was led by Cromwell, who I talked about yesterday. And, they would just be like, well, if you can, now accept that the supreme head of the church in England is the king, then you can keep your monastery and keep doing the things you're doing. But of course, these monks were Catholics. They had pledged a vow to the religious ideas of Christianity and Catholicism, which of course were centered on the supreme authority of the Pope. And so a lot of them were turned away, their property was confiscated. A lot of them had animals, farming, as farms, and they just took it. And wealth, gold too. And so this dissolution of the dissolving of the monasteries took about 4 years. So this is an important little piece of background for what's coming next, because you can see that while many people in England still held on to the ideas of the Catholic Church, there was this new rise of Protestantism that was coming on very strongly. And so these two groups were going to really come to this place of a big, big conflict. Who was going to actually be in charge of the religious life of England? Was it going to be in the king, or was it going to be turned back into the hands of the Pope? And at this time, I think it's important for us to realize that you can't just imagine that the people that were living during this time, the 1500s, 1600s, that they were just like us. because they weren't. They weren't. They were raised in different kinds of ways than we are. They didn't question a lot of things. I mean, some of them did. So many of them were illiterate. And, and so religion was something incredibly powerful in their lives. And really, common people, ordinary people, were in one way or another really devoted to their religions. And the churches were a place of community where you could go and go to mass every week and see your friends and have conversations. And if you needed something, maybe the priest there could help you. And there were real places of power. And so now here somebody comes in, the king, and it's like, no, we're changing all this now. And so it was very unsettling for a lot of people. And for others, it was wonderful. They were extremely happy that now they were taking this on as Englishmen, their own church. So this happened, this dissolution, and then, as I said, Henry got very obese and couldn't exercise, and he had this gaping wound that kept being reinfected and reinfected, and he finally died. Catherine Parr was his last wife. She had been very good stepmother to Edward and Elizabeth, and so now Edward comes to the throne. He's around 9 years old, and he can't rule, of course, until he's a young teenager, and so he has these men around him that are really sort of running the country. And there's a couple of different factions, I should say, going on sort of behind the scenes, because he's not really able to kind of take power. He's 10 years old, 10 years old. So there's a group over here that are very, very committed to keeping the religious ideas that Henry had pushed through. And this was very important to them, that they were going to really turn England into a Protestant country. And a lot of these men were great thinkers, and they were very devoted to their religion, to this new religion. And they wanted to do everything they could to unify England as a Protestant country. And then there were other men behind the scenes who were in there for power and greed and control. That here was a young boy, and we're just going to manipulate the situation to get as much power and control as we can for ourselves. And you also still, somewhere in the background, have these Catholics who still have an allegiance to the Pope and are not walking around the streets saying this, but still have this belief that this was wrong, that Anne Boleyn was a horrible person to break up this Catholic marriage, that Elizabeth is a bastard, she's an illegitimate child, that she should never come to the throne. And even Edward, from his third wife, didn't really belong there. That the only one who truly belonged there was Mary, the first girl from his first marriage. So there's a struggle going on. There's these factions sort of behind the scenes. And so Edward does come to throne. He's a young teenager. He rules until he's about 16 or 17. And he pretty much takes up a very strong stand on, we are going to become a Protestant nation. We're going to stick with the ideas my fathers pushed through. I am the supreme head of the church, besides being the head of the country. And so he really, he commissions this archbishop to write a common prayer book that all the churches will use. They'll all use this prayer book throughout England. The Bible is translated into English, so now those people who can read are able to read the original text, which, remember, was something Luther wanted also with the Germans. So people can read the text of the Bible and ask questions about it and start to really think intellectually about the ideas of religion. And then also the services, the church services, like going to Mass, have been done in Latin, which most people couldn't understand, they were now starting to be done in English. So you see this real shift away from the way the Catholic religion was set up to becoming something that was slightly different. And Edward really pushed these things through, and it was a big priority for him. But he dies at 17. Some kind of illness, not quite sure what, but he dies. And now, who is to come to the throne? Well, he tried to put in writing that his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, who was a Protestant, would rise to the throne. But Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Henry's first daughter, was not going to let this happen. She was determined that she was the rightful heir among anybody, including Edward, and that she was not going to be bamboozled out of taking the throne. And so she rallies quite a few of important noblemen, and she rides into London with Elizabeth, her half-sister, who she really didn't care for, but she does take her, and I'm going to assume my role as the next Queen of England. Now, there had been no queens in Europe. It had always been, if you were called a queen, it was because your husband was the king. You were never went to the throne on your own as a woman. I mean, that was pretty much like, are you kidding? Woman can't do this. But she had the determination. She inherited those qualities from her mother and from her father, that no, she was the right one, and she was going to take over this. And she was a Catholic. So she had this mission to get back England into the fold of Catholicism and to return the seat of power to the Pope and not to the king or to the queen. So she wants to bring back this papal power where she thinks it belongs. So you got the picture? Henry breaks with the church, King of England, supreme head of the church. His son Edward comes to the throne, same idea, Protestant England. Now it's put in the hands of a Catholic, and a devout Catholic. I mean, her mother, she was separated from her mother, you remember that, but she kept up her early training that she'd received from her mother. She studied, probably in secret. She attended masses, and she was bent on this idea that she was going to bring England back into the arms of the Pope. So she is, she's quite old. She is 37 when she comes to the throne, and she was unmarried. There had been several attempts. Henry had several attempts to marry her off, but somehow it just never worked. And you know, these marriages were not about love or relationship. They were about alliances. So maybe she was on her way to marry this one, but then he fell out of favor. And so she's 37, which is also an old age to be bearing children. But she's not married. And so she does marry through an alliance, a king of Spain, Philip of Spain. And this, let me just back up for a second. So when she rides into London to say, no, I'm the queen. I'm going to take the queen. I'm the queen, not some cousin. The crowds were cheering for her because remember, she was the first princess for a long, long time. And she was beloved by the people of England. They kind of had watched her grown up. And when she was born, Henry was quite, he figured he'd have 3, 4, 5 sons like his father. He wasn't worried about it at that point. And he was fine having a girl, and he paraded her around and showed her off. And And she was extremely bright, just like her father. She was an excellent musician. And so the people of England, they knew her. They had watched her grow up. And so there was a lot of, a lot of cheering for her through the streets. But when she makes this decision to marry a foreigner, not an Englishman, and someone from Spain, then the people begin to turn against her. Because, first of all, they're worried that this Spanish prince, or I don't know, I think he was a prince, or, he was going to somehow influence too much their English culture and their English way of life. And they didn't want that. They didn't trust that. And plus, he was also an extremely devout Catholic. So you have the two of them now on the throne, these really zealots of Catholicism, and they're determined to bring back that religion to England. And so a lot of persecutions begin. The archbishop who wrote that prayer book, remember I said there was that prayer book that all the Protestant churches in England were supposed to use. He was very, very popular and very famous. His name was Kramer, I think. She has him burned at the stake as a heretic because he's promoting this Protestant religion. And during her reign, she burned at the stake over 300 people, including many of them who were just common people who would not relinquish their Protestant allegiance. And so she starts to prosecute them as heretics, and she doesn't care. She burns bishops, she burns archbishops. She just, if it's decided you're a heretic, then you're going against the Catholic Church, you're going against the Pope, then you will experience hell fires on earth. I mean, that was why they burned them. Was, okay, you want to see what hell's like? We're going to show you what hell is like. So she earned herself the nickname of Bloody Mary. That's what she's called in history. And like all of history, there's different shades of experience, right? There's different sort of shades of what was real and what truly happened. And she did do all those things. But Henry also burned people at the stake and also beheaded people, including two of his wives. But he doesn't, that's not how we remember him. And the next queen to come is going to do the same thing also. But for some reason with her, it really stuck. And some historians think it was because she was the first woman. And maybe it was a bit of this, well, she's a woman, we're really going to tag her with a bad name. I don't know. But she did do some incredible things when she was on the throne. And one of them was really forward-thinking. It was called the Act of Regal Power. And what this was that queens hold power as fully and absolutely as their male predecessors. I mean, what she put into law was that a woman can rule as equally strong as a man. And she kind of put this, let's get beyond gender. It's not going to be whether it's a man or a woman. It's like if you're the next in line, whether you're a man or a woman, you are going to be able to rule with authority. And that was a very radical idea for her to push through. She rebuilt the Navy, which is going to be extremely important in the next reign. And she even restructured the economy that was in pretty bad shape. So she had a lot of really smart ideas, but she was unhappy, and she could be very rigid about her ideas. Very sort of, it was this Catholic way and nothing else. And her husband did not really like her once he was married to her. He thought she was unattractive. And there were a couple of times rumors that she was pregnant, but then she really wasn't. And eventually he started almost spending all of his time in Europe. and not even being in England with her. So she had this lonely childhood where she was taken from her mother, whom she loved dearly, and was not even allowed to see her when her mother was dying, and then having to wrestle to get her rightful place as the queen, and having this unhappy marriage and this obsession with bringing back Catholicism made for a very unhappy kind of existence for this woman. So it's also a sad time for Elizabeth, for her sister, her half-sister. Because Elizabeth, remember, the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, was raised as a Protestant. I mean, there are Protestants because of her mother. So she's raised as a Protestant. But when Mary comes to the throne, she has to hide this. And she does hide it. And she tries to go to Mass, Catholic Mass, every Sunday. And she tries to stay because there's spies everywhere. Absolutely everywhere there's spies. And so she has to, be seen reading her Catholic prayer book and saying her prayers and praying to the saints. And she has to really knows that she has to save her head by being a good Catholic. And so she is constantly kind of looking over her shoulder to see what could possibly, she knows that these heretics are being burned, 300 people, that's a lot of people. She doesn't want to be one of them. So she's lives at other castles. They kind of move her around to other castles, and she's a bit in the background, but there's always somebody really watching her. And so at one point, there is Mary, Queen Mary, finds out that there's a Protestant rebellion going on, that some noblemen do not like this push back towards Catholicism, and that they're going to rise up an army, and they're going to get rid of her. I don't know what that meant, but they were going to get rid of her, and they were going to put Elizabeth on the throne. And so she finds out about this. Mary finds out about this. And she's determined that she's going to put down the rebellion, which she does. But when her spies tell her that the plan is to get rid of her and put Elizabeth on the throne, she's furious. She's absolutely furious. Now, history says that Elizabeth knew nothing about this, at least for now, that she was not involved in this, that she was content to have her sister on the throne, that she just was trying to save her own head day by day by day. But Mary sends for her. Mary sends for her, orders her to come to London. And so her ladies in waiting, they've got her in the carriage and they're bringing her to London. And as she comes into London, she hasn't been there in a while, long time, she sees burned corpses sort of hanging from posts on the way into London. And then she sees heads sort of, on the top of these posts. And it just sends this shudder through her because she knows that these are the Protestant heretics. She knows it. And so she thinks she's going to the castle, and then she sort of deposited, a certain place, like a holding castle for a bit. And then very, very shortly after, she's picked up and she's put on this barge on the Thames River. And she's not sure what the heck is going on. She's got her ladies in waiting with her. And these guards are transporting her on this barge along the Thames River. And she looks up and she realizes she's going to the Tower of London. Now, the Tower of London it's not a tower. It's a castle, a very huge stone fortress that was built by William the Conqueror, remember, in 1066 when he came and took over. And it's this place where part of it is where they have like grand celebrations and, beautiful, you know, festival things, but the majority of it is a prison. It's a prison. And it is a place where people are tortured and killed. And so she sees the barge is taking her there. And she's convinced that this is it. And she's been begging since she's been in London, please let me see my sister. Please let me get her a letter. Please, I want to tell her that I am truly faithful to her, that I have no part in this rebellion, that I have no desire to take over the throne from her. Please, but Mary won't see her. Not at this point. And so, she's seen those corpses. She's seen those heads. She knows what happens in the Tower of London. They next to so there's the Tower of London, and there's the chapel, and next to the chapel is the executioner's sort of stage with the chopping block where her mother's head was cut off. So she sees this right next to the prison. And so the barge is coming up, and it goes under the tower, under the London Bridge, right? And it's making its way to the tower. And it's raining. It's Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday before Easter. Easter is the most important festival, holiday in the Catholic Church. It's when Christ rose from the dead. And it's Palm Sunday. It's the week before. And she's being, floated to the Tower of London. And so they get there, and there's a gate. You can imagine, you've all looked at medieval pictures, right? It's a gate with the spikes on the end. And the gate is up, right? And it's called, that gate that they've brought her to is called Traitor's Gate. So she's brought into the tower through Traitor's Gate. And so the iron gate is up, right? And she looks up and she sees the spikes there. And she's 20 years old at this point. So Elizabeth's, around 37, a little bit older than that. She's around 20. And so she steps off the barge, and she's sort of standing on this stone walkway there. And it's been raining, and this guard, takes his coat off to put his coat down so that she can step on his coat. And she, she sort of throws her hands like, get away. I don't want your coat. I'll walk myself. I mean, this is the kind of girl she is. She's truly Henry's daughter. So she starts to sort of climb this circular staircase, these cold stone steps. And she's climbing up, and she climbs up a few steps, and she stops. And all of a sudden, it's like everything hits her. She's young, she's attractive, she's intelligent, she's full of life, she's full of ideas and curiosity, she's strong-willed, and she has this reckoning of like, this is it. This is going to be it. And she sits down on the steps. She just sits there. And she kind of refuses to get up. And it's as if this whole emotion just comes pouring out of her when she realizes, what is waiting for her. And that's not even just thinking about death. I mean, think about the torture thing, right? Tortured. Were you part of this rebellion? What do you know? Who are the people involved in the rebellion? Who contacted you in the rebellion? I mean, her mind must have just been going crazy with all the horrible possibilities of what she was going to face. And then, as if she was really like speaking to herself, but she was also speaking to God, she says, "O Lord, I never thought to have come here as a prisoner. And I pray you, all good friends," so her ladies in waiting in there's these guards, "bear me witness that I come in here no traitor. I come in here as no traitor, but true as a woman to the Queen's majesty as any living now. But as true a woman to the Queen's majesty as anyone living now. So she just kind of makes this proclamation, like, I'm completely innocent and committed to the Queen. And I guess by all accounts, this little tiny speech was so moving because she did have a way of speaking. We're going to hear about that. That was very powerful. That one of the guard ushers, I guess, got tears in his eyes. And, you know, she was there, and then she looked up and she saw this in him, and it infuriated her. Like, you know, don't show me your weakness. I have no time for your weakness. And she kind of took a deep breath and, you know, in her very Elizabeth way, kind of held her head up and climbed the rest of the stairs. The door was unlocked, and she went into this stone, cold room with her ladies in waiting. And she kind of looked around, and there were 3 small windows, you know, at the top of the room. That's the only place where the light was coming in. And she looked up at those windows, and then she heard the door behind her lock. And she had no idea what tomorrow was going to bring for her. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop. And tomorrow we will continue with the story of Elizabeth, a truly unique, one kind of a woman in world history. So you have homework, you had the map, and then this timeline, and I'm going to put something else on homework later today for you to do, something pretty simple. Okay, have a good day, afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow.